The most striking mental health indicator in this case is the repeated police contact over several years, specifically for mental health concerns, including multiple instances where the individual was apprehended for formal assessment and follow-up care. I'm a licensed professional counselor, and in this episode of The Clinical File, I'll examine the mental health indicators and psychological layers of the Jesse Van Rootselaar case. This clinical analysis is based on my speculations. It's not a diagnosis of anyone involved in this case. One of the most compelling red flags appears in the history of law enforcement interactions. Authorities visited residents on multiple occasions over the past several years to address mental health concerns regarding the suspect. On at least 2 documented instances, the suspect was taken in for a formal mental health assessment. This pattern suggests ongoing and significant psychological distress that required intervention from crisis services. Such repeated contacts often point to escalating struggles that may include severe mood dysregulation, disassociation, or other impairing conditions that go beyond typical adolescent challenges. This case began with a devastating event on February 10, 2026, in the remote community of Tumbler Ridge, British Columbia. Jesse Van Rootselaar, an 18-year-old resident, first killed her 39-year-old mother and 11-year-old stepbrother at their family home. She then proceeded approximately 1 mile to the Tumbler Ridge Secondary School, where she killed 5 students between the ages of 12 and 13. Along with one 39-year-old teacher. 2 additional students sustained gunshot wounds but survived. Van Rootselaar was found deceased at the school from what authorities determined to be a self-inflicted gunshot wound. The total fatalities stand at 8 victims plus the suspect. Police have confirmed that Van Rootselaar was born biologically male but began transitioning to female approximately 6 years prior, around the age of 12, and identified as female both socially and publicly. This recent tragedy represents one of Canada's most severe mass shootings in recent years. As of mid-February 2026, the Royal Canadian Mounted Police continue their investigation, with no final determination on motive released. They have emphasized that it remains too early to speculate on the reasons behind the actions. Investigators are reviewing prior interactions with both police and the public healthcare system to prepare a fuller picture. A key psychological element here involves the presence of long-standing mental health challenges. The repeated police welfare checks and apprehensions for assessment indicate that the distress had been visible to authorities for years. In clinical terms, when someone experiences multiple crisis interventions without sustained resolution, it can reflect an underlying issue such as chronic emotional instability or difficulty engaging with ongoing support. This does not explain or excuse the violence, but it does highlight how untreated or partially treated severe psychological pain can compound over time. Another layer here appears in the reports of substance use concerns documented in archived online activity. Substance use disorders frequently co-occur with mental health conditions, sometimes as a form of self-medication for overwhelming emotions, trauma, or identity-related stress. When combined with access to firearms, this intersection raises serious risk factors in hindsight. Reports also indicate prior police seizure of firearms from the residents a couple of years earlier, though those were later returned following the petition by the owner. The firearms used in the attack were not registered to Van Rootselaar, and her firearms license had expired in 2024. Questions continue to persist about how access was possible despite the history. From a psychological perspective, the choice to target both family members and then a former school environment suggests complex feelings of betrayal, rejection, or unresolved rage directed at intimate and institutional figures. Familiar violence often stems from perceived abandonment or deep interpersonal wounds, while school-targeted attacks can reflect accumulative grievances tied to social isolation, bullying, or feelings of alienation. But without a clear motive statement, these remain speculative based on common patterns in similar cases. Online footprints reportedly show posts about mental health difficulties, substance use, and the interest in guns and hunting. Some sources noted expressions of fascination with violent extremism or radical content. Such online behavior can serve as a window into radicalization process, where vulnerable individuals seek belonging or validation in extreme ideologies during periods of psychological turmoil. This does not mean ideology was the primary driver, but it illustrates how digital spaces can amplify existing distress. The decision to end her own life after the attacks aligns with patterns seen in some mass violence incidents where perpetrators view the act as a final statement before self-destruction. This can reflect profound helplessness where the individual perceives no viable path forward. In mental health terms, suicidal ideation combined with homicidal actions represents an extreme collapse of coping mechanism. Isolation appears to have played a significant role here. Van Rootselaar had dropped out of the same school approximately 4 years earlier, around the age of 14. Dropping out during early adolescence often correlates with escalating mental health struggles, academic failure to emotional barriers, or withdrawal from social supports. In a small remote community like Tumbler Ridge, with roughly 2,400 residents, limited access to specialized mental health care resources can intensify feelings of being trapped or unseen. The transition process itself adds another dimension. Beginning at age 12, during a critical developmental window, gender identity exploration occurs amid puberty and peer pressures. For some, this brings relief. For others, it can coincide with heightened anxiety, depression, or family conflict if support varies. Police interactions over mental health begin in the years following the start of this transition, though no direct link has been stated. If this breakdown of escalated risk factors and missed intervention opportunities gave you the moment of recognition about how mental health crisis can build silently, then do me a small favor and hit that subscribe button. Not because I need the validation, but because if you don't, I'll just sit here analyzing my empty subscriber graph. Just kidding. Subscribe so we can keep unpacking these darkest minds together. No therapy bill is required. Behavioral clues point to a gradual escalation here. The prior confiscation of return of firearms combined with the expired licensing underscores gaps in monitoring high-risk individuals. In psychological risk assessment, access to lethal means during the periods of known instability represents a critical concern. The fact that multiple agencies had contact, yet the outcome occurred, suggests systematic challenges in connecting the dots across mental health, law enforcement, and firearm regulations. The victimology also merits reflection. The family victims were immediate household members, which often indicates familiar dynamics gone catastrophically wrong. The school victims were young adolescents and one educator targeted in a familiar setting. This choice may reflect projected anger onto symbols of authority or normalcy that the perpetrator felt excluded from. In terms of the potential underlying factors, chronic mental health struggles without adequate long-term intervention can lead to a sense of despair. When someone experiences repeated crisis responses but lacks consistent therapy, medication management, or community support, the risk of catastrophic acting out increases. This case illustrates the tragic consequences when early warning signs do not translate into preventative care. The community's response has focused on grief and healing. Vigils have been held, and leaders have called for reflection on mental health services in rural areas. British Columbia's Premier has requested more details on prior health system interactions to identify potential improvements. From a clinical standpoint, cases like this remind us that mental health crises rarely emerge without precursors. Repeated police welfare checks, substance use references, social withdrawal, and access to means all form a constellation of risk. Prevention requires bridging gaps between crisis intervention and sustained support. The investigation continues to examine digital evidence, including social media and potential online radicalization, alongside health records. As more details emerge, they may clarify the sequence of psychological decline. What stands out the most to me is the preventable nature of such suffering on all sides. Families, schools, and communities bear lasting scars, while the suspect's actions stem from profound untreated pain. Understanding these layers do not justify harm, but helps inform better systems for the future. If walking through this case gave you new insight into how untreated mental health struggles combined with the other risk factors can lead to tragedy, I'd love to keep bringing you these breakdowns. Subscribe if you want the next one to land in your feed. That way you'll always have the psychological context ready when the next big case breaks. It's free, and it only takes 2 seconds, and it helps me make content that actually matters. And yet, another school shooting. Every single year, there are multiple cases of school shootings. It is tragic every single time. And every case that I can think of in school shootings involves the perpetrator that has some form of mental health issues and a lot of pain and a lot of trauma. And that's the same case here. It's easy to point the finger at the perpetrator and say that person is evil. But we really, if we want change, if we want transformation, we need to stop pointing the fingers and start asking questions and start demanding that mental health needs to take a priority with law enforcement, with school systems, with everything. And people are hurting. And when they're not heard, they're going to hurt other people. And they're going to make a big statement. And unfortunately, that's what happened here. So what did you think about this case? Were there any elements about this that stood out to you? Thank you for joining me today. Until next time, stay curious, stay safe.